because of the central location of Foyer Européen, make it to 5 minutes.
Yeah, let's start in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
That would be just 5 minutes of politeness.
Yeah, exactly. In the meantime, maybe we can do like some other artists or people. We just have like a slow, unofficial start of our debate and discussion without really starting. Maybe you have a favorite joke you would like to tell.
That's a very tricky question. It's almost like, what's your favorite book? Because there are too many books that I like, and same with jokes. I think the best joke is the joke that was that has been told on the right time, and the beginning of the speech doesn't feel like right time for jokes.
That's very interesting. I was maybe trying to like get you in to tell me a joke about the topic also. I know that there was a publication at a German university, I don't remember which one, in the end of the 1990s, with forbidden jokes from the Soviet Union. So jokes which in the early days of the NKVD repressions got you to jail. And when you read this book, it was really interesting that jokes can get you to jail in totalitarian systems. And so yeah, I don't remember any of them, but it would be quite fitting. And I'm pretty sure.
At least, were they funny?
I remember that some of them were. But
excuse me, I have a feeling that I sound much louder than you
that's
do.
because my voice is very soft.
Oh, okay.
Very soft one. I can also speak into the mic directly. Yeah, it's generally like really tricky for videographers. I will quickly have a check on him. He says it's fine, okay, yeah, but generally I speak either too far away or too slowly and not loudly. It's just what I do. Yeah, the jokes were funny, yeah, there were some funny jokes. But the only ones which come to my mind now are the jokes that President Reagan told about the Soviet Union. In his second term during the electoral campaign, he at the rallies would always tell jokes about the Soviet Union. And these jokes are coming to my mind right now, but they are not particularly funny. Tell one. There is two businessmen, a Soviet and an American businessman. They meet, I think, in Helsinki at the airport in the lounge, and they start talking and realizing that they have a lot in common. And then the one guy from the US says, you know, I love the United States because I can do and say whatever I want to, you know. I can go into Ronald Reagan's office in the White House and I can enter the office and I can shout at him and say, Mr. Reagan, I don't like how you run your country. And then the Soviet businessman says, but I can do the same thing. And he says, like, really, can you do that? Yes, I can go to the White House and say, Ronald Reagan, I hate how you're running this country. So this is one of the jokes, for instance. But it's 5 minutes past. We had a very cheap laugh on behalf of Ronald Reagan. And so let's start. While we were preparing this, we had a very challenging and difficult task to first of all define what is a dialogue and debate, because we are supposed to be debating together and we are supposed to be dialoguing together. And once we settled for that, we also had a title in mind, which is Ballet, Bots and Bullets. And one of the B's I think that we could actually add is also ballots, so votes. How do you feel about the title of this evening?
I think we did a good job because we've been trying to figure out which title will attract more people, and I think we did a good job. Many people came, and the title is exactly in terms of marketing, worked well. But surprisingly, we will really be talking about things that are related to the title. I mean, how art, how weapons and propaganda, how they work together.
And I mean, we are all here because we have some pre-notions how this works in modern times today and how it's is working in Europe, in Ukraine. But I think we have to go back a bit in time into the Soviet propaganda and into the Soviet Union, because basically there we find the blueprint of the propaganda which we find today. Also, your findings as an academic and as a writer, what would you say are the most striking resemblances that you met and found between those two systems?
I think one of the mistakes we are making while talking about Soviet propaganda and Soviet Union is thinking that Soviet Union was a homogeneous state and it was the same in 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. In general, the Soviet Union before the Second World War and Soviet Union and Soviet propaganda after that, those are two different countries, two different empires. And now, for instance, during the protests of young people, for instance, pro-Palestine protests now in Europe, we can see some communist sympathizers who are even carrying Soviet flags and Soviet symbols and saying that we are, and they sound surprisingly liberal because they are saying that we support equality, we support access to different services for all the people, and so on. But these were the slogans of the Soviet Union in 20s, in 30s. And who knows, if we are talking honestly to ourselves, who knows, maybe in 20s, if I was living back then in the Soviet Union, maybe I would even have supported that idea because it sounds really compelling. It sounds really just because it's about equality, it's about science, it's about like inter-religious communities and so on. So it sounds reasonable. But Soviet propaganda after the Second World War, it's absolutely different because basically it becomes Russian centric. It becomes just like, we have a good word for that. We have the word in Ukraine now that has appeared after 22. It's racism. So it becomes like that. Russia was in the center. The model of a good Soviet citizen becomes a Russian one. If you, for example, if you see check the research of how often did other representatives of other nations in the Soviet Union spoke on Soviet TV, you would see that only Russians were given voice. If we are talking about Gagarin, the guy who went to space from Soviet Union, he was chosen just because he had a nice Slavic face, nice smile, and he looked Russian enough. So as you can see, this when we talk about Soviet Union, let's not talk before the Second World War. That's another story. That's another tragic, dramatic story with repressions and so on, but that's another ideology. And after the Second World War, Russia has felt the right to be Russian-centric, Russia-centric, to be, and to actually not to take into account other nations at all. So the modern Russia is absolutely, it continues the tradition of the Soviet Union, and they want themselves to, they want to look like Soviet Union, they want to behave like Soviet Union, and they see themselves as the as Soviets basically.
But basically, what you're saying is quite interesting because at that period of the Soviet Union, let's mark, for instance, the death of Stalin. You could basically say that the Second World War stretches much, much longer in Russia and in the Soviet Union with the death of Stalin in the 50s. By that time, in other parts of the world, we see decolonization happening. In Southeast Asia, we see it happening in Northern Africa. We see France, Great Britain losing the grip on their colonial empire, while the repressions of Stalin and also the repression of Stalin towards ethnic communities is within the Soviet Union basically tightened his grip So a decolonization at that point was actually not possible in Russia.
And yeah, absolutely. And it is still not possible in Russia because we can only see now the colonization ongoing, and those nations that are a part of big Russia, now Russian empire, as they call themselves, they want to be, they are losing their chance to decolonize themselves. We are really hoping for that. And in Ukraine, there have been big hopes in 22 that, okay, they see that's a nonsense, that's a big war, they now see what's happening and they will try to rise, but they don't, because they are being colonized for decades and decades, and it gets harder and harder for them. So yeah, Russia does go against the world trends. That's true. It did it all the time, and it does it, and it does it now.
And what role in that period plays the Russian language? Because it suddenly becomes a lingua franca for all these countries. And how do we still see the role of the Russian language nowadays and its role in propaganda? Because I have the feeling that it started a bit at this point also.
Well, language is a means of communication, and you can see it here as well. And of course, Russian propaganda is more effective when it comes to people, to communities that speak Russian. And for instance, in Germany, there are big communities that have not assimilated. And that who don't speak German, who don't want to learn German, and of course they lean to Russian TV, Russian media outlets. It was very visible and very effective back in 2014. And same story in Baltic states, where there are those closed Russian communities that are now considered to be a real danger to those countries, like Estonia and Narva, that is a big Russian community. And of course, the state is now worried that these Russian speakers, they are influenced by Russian propaganda. And if Russia decides to invade Estonia, which is a tiny country, and of course they are living under stress now. They are afraid of what is going to come, and Russian language is a tool, and it has always been a tool. And if you remember that from this, well, you don't remember obviously that from the Soviet times, but
I look younger than I am. I look much younger. So who knows?
but neither do I, but we both can remember that from what we've read, that in 20s and in 30s as well. I mean, of course, the past century. There was this Soviet idea of lingua franca, and Stalin himself said that we don't need Russian language in Soviet Union. We will build a new language. We will build a new language. It won't be Russian, it won't be German, it won't be French, but it would be a different language. It was of course a utopian idea, not possible. There was an Soviet attempt of supporting Esperanto. They tried to develop all this infrastructure of Esperanto in the Soviet Union. There have been dozens of Esperanto communities. There were even collective farms called in Esperanto. That's just sounds crazy. But then suddenly they abandoned the idea just because it was too complicated, and that's obvious. That's obvious that you can't, if you have these 150 languages in your community, and you have big Russian-speaking community. Of course, it would be a reasonable thing to do to Russify everyone, even, and of course the metropole, the center is Russian speaking. It's the language of prestige, and it was reasonable just to abandon the idea of this utopian lingua franca and go with Russian. That was and of course Russian has become the only official language for everything. They even talked like that languages have different functions. And we don't want local languages to get too tired. they have to rest. So if you want them to serve some cultural events, maybe some dances, maybe some fairy tales for kiddos, but not for too grown-ups, teenagers, maybe not, maybe they better read Russian already. But local languages have to rest. And all the high level functions, of course, they belong to Russian. And if you compare even the topics of the books that have been published in the Soviet Union in Russian and in local languages, well, that's just obvious. Everything that you needed to be successful in life, like science, engineering, which is was top in the Soviet Union, that it was like the top career. So everything that would connect you to the hopes of the better life would be in Russian. And then they say, but then they give the opportunity for the parents to choose the language of instruction at schools for their children. And of course, parents want better life for their kids. They see that they can receive the full education in Russian only, that they can build their careers in Russian only, that the language of prestige is Russian. And of course, for those of us who have kids, we know that we want something better for our kids. And of course, parents would tend to pick Russian as a language of instruction for their kids. So that's how Russian became the only language of prestige, the lingua franca of the Soviet Union. And now they say that other nations have voluntarily abandoned their languages.
But there is also obviously another side of the coin to this development, because it also meant that very huge languages with lots of speakers, like Ukrainian, like also Belarusian, were suppressed also during that time. So you talked a lot now about the promotion of these of the lingua franca Russian, but how in that time was, for instance, the Ukrainian language suppressed?
That's a tricky question, because if we are talking about Russian Empire, the Tsarist times, you can see the full list of official documents signed by the Russian Empire, by the government, that were banning different languages, including Ukrainian. You can even you even have a Wikipedia page with the list of the bans of Ukrainian language in Tsarist Russia, and you can see this year there was a ban for printing books. This year there was a ban for universities. This book. And so on. So it is very easy to see, to prove this is the country that suppresses languages. When it comes to Soviet Union, it gets much more complicated, because it was all under the source of voluntary choice, that it was their free choice to choose Russian and to abandon their local languages. But basically we have just these two documents, official documents, that would prove that Russian has been promoted and other languages have been suppressed. First, it's 38, and it's the compulsory studying of Russian in all schools of the Soviet Union. That's the first document, and second, it was 58, and it was about this free choice of language of instruction at school. So only two documents, and everything else was. I think it's even more. It's more complicated, and it's more difficult to prove that these languages have been oppressed. What you can see, just statistics, like that among the Russian speakers, less than one of the Soviet Union, less than 1% spoke other languages. I mean that Russian specialists would come to different republics. They would work at the factories normally as supervisors, but they didn't care to learn local languages at all. So, and also statistics of printing books, statistics that you did not have an access to education in local language. So this kind of oppression. There wasn't a document that would say, we as a Soviet Union forbid using this and this language. But for some reason, languages have been dying and dying and dying all the time. Even though Khrushchev, from Stalin to Khrushchev, everyone has been saying that we support the local languages, all the languages are equal. Of course, they have different functions. We have to we want local languages to rest a little bit. We don't want them to overwork, but they would verbally support.
Yeah.
But when it comes to practical issues, they would be suppressed, of course.
And then, of course, you had mass movements of people who were forcefully moved or brought to somewhere, which influenced also the local languages. And the Donbass is a very good example of that, because it was the influx of people from elsewhere, from other republics, Soviet republics, which basically tipped in favor or had more people suddenly speaking Russian than Ukrainian in Donbass during the mechanization, as they called it, of Donbass. So it's also a fact that many people
it was an economic strategy to move people, to mix people, to make this cauldron of people, as they would call it. And it's also one of the factors why different countries have been Russified. So, and also there was another factor of Russification that strikes me so much, is that there have been these lagers for like concentration camps for instance, in Kazakhstan, and many Ukrainians have been sent there. And those Ukrainians who would come to Kazakhstan, there was a huge town of those who were in jail, of the repressed town. And these people, they would somehow connect with locals. And what was their common language? It was Russian. So those repressed themselves became Russifiers of the local people. That strikes me, because it's just they didn't want to do that. It wasn't their choice to be repressed. It wasn't their choice to, but they needed to survive, and they became Russifiers themselves. And also another thing that strikes me when it comes to Russification, and it's not related to Ukraine, it's related to so-called northern people of Russia, that it was obligatory up until 70s. It was obligatory to send your children to the boarding schools, but basically it wasn't the choice of the parents. The children were taken from the families, saying that you need to develop your children, they can't stay with you, so you need to send them to boarding schools. And of course, at boarding schools, it was forbidden to speak their local languages. And in just one generation, there was an entire generation that lost the ability to communicate with their grandparents. That's a very painful story. Of course, I know that it's not a technique that only Soviet Union used. It was in Canada, there was such practices much earlier, of course, much earlier. We are not talking about 70s. It's a very common colonial practice, but it strikes me because it was up until 70s. And now these people who have been sent to those boarding schools, their children and their grandchildren, they come to Ukraine to kill Ukrainians. They don't speak their local languages. They just look a little, they don't look Slavic, but they are colonized fully, and they have lost the access to their heritage, to their origins.
There's obviously a lot of generational trauma connected with this, and which is still visible today. And it is quite striking and interesting that the Russian modern propaganda is playing exactly into these feelings, for instance, by claiming a very popular claim in Western Europe. Well, claim, I would say, that if you would make a survey in the street, I guess that 15 to 20, 30% of the people here would believe it, mainly that Russian language is being forbidden in Ukraine or it's being repressed. And there has been this very famous saying that don't believe anything until Russia denies it. But talking about just that, how do you deal with this when you must also hear it quite a lot in Europe when people say, but aren't the Ukrainians repressing the Russian language? And what is your reply to this very, very prominent Russian propaganda point, which is out here?
Of course, the easiest way would be up until 22 would be come to Ukraine and listen to the street how people speak. That would be the easiest way. But of course, now I'm not inviting anyone to Ukraine. It's just so it's too dangerous to go there. Maybe so I don't feel okay with that to say like come and listen to the street or come and listen to how people talk. But what about you? Was it was one of the narratives of the 2014. It was like strike in there. How about you?
So.
Did you personally at first did you believe that Ukraine is too radical in the when it comes to languages?
Well, let me tell you just a few personal stories about the topics of language. One very interesting one comes to my mind was my first visit to Kiev in 2005. Orange banners in the streets, still staying at Hotel Rus, Olympijski, so close to the stadium. Heading down to the small shop in the lobby at night to catch a banakwa, because I was thirsty after the long night, let's put it like this. And so, me who had learned Russian from my father, because he had learned Russian and I just had his old books, I go down in the lobby at night, first night, and I just tell this guy, "Один вода, пожалуйста." And he corrects me, "Будь ласка." And it was really interesting. It wasn't like a bad correction. It wasn't like you stupid 18-year-old boy. It was really like trying to tell me there's much more to this. And so this is like one of my first stories of clashing. And but I think that as you just said, it has been a very prominent propaganda point that has been pushed here quite a lot, because I think it plays quite well with European audiences, but for other reasons. It plays quite well in the general feeling of people's, I call it sleeping xenophobia with Europeans. So Europeans are really xenophobic, in my opinion, and quite wary of something else. And so there's, especially also in Luxembourg, the fear that the language can disappear. So it plays quite well with this, with these feelings. And it's the same in the bigger metropoles, where it plays really well with certain demographics. So I think it is quite easy to push this and have people suddenly fear that, oh, if Ukrainians are maybe forbidding this language, what else are they able to do? And this is what I always say to people when I try to explain Russian propaganda. It's like the most, for me, the most destructive thing, and I always repeat this, what they do is they manage to put a doubt in people's minds. So, and this small seed of doubt is a devastating energy, and it's a devastating small seed of hate. So once you are doubting something, even if you don't believe it 100%, you will still think about this somehow, and it stays within your knowledge, and it stays especially when you are taking decisions. And to quote also, last year I was interviewing a lot of European diplomats who I asked, but did you really believe that at this point, like that there were Nazis in Maidan and that there was Nazi regime in Kiev? And they said, but it was presented to us like this from the Russian diplomats. So
you pointed out a very important point.
Yeah.
A very important point, that propaganda in general, and especially Russian propaganda as a model in the modern world. So a very well-financed model, that's also very important, because there are many people who want to share fake stories with you and want to disinform you. But this is a very state-financed, well-organized, state-financed model. And the very important point here is that they do not try to convince you in something. They do not, their intention is not that you believe in those fake stories.
Absolutely.
They want to blur the truth as good as possible, to blur the truth. They want you to be hesitant. They want you to be like those, their favorite expressions. Правда посередине. I mean that the truth is in between. It's somewhere in between the 2 points. If someone says this, and that's very well connected to this principle of balance, of media balance. When you invite one side and you invite another side.
Yeah.
That's of course that's a very blatant example, and it's reductio ad Hitlerum. I don't want to do that, but anyway, you don't invite a Nazi and you don't invite a victim, and you say, okay, now debate,
where's the
and the
truth?
truth is in between. It's not like that. You don't invite a terrorist who would so a terrorist and a victim. It's not like that. But that's their tool. They want you to be hesitant. They want you to think that, okay, maybe, and there is also a very nice saying in Russian, всей правды мы не узнаем. It means that the truth will not be known to the end.
Yeah.
So we have to be hesitant all the time. And this is, you said that that's a very important point, that it does matter when you take decisions, because you're not sure what to do. And now, when in 2022 it looked like a very black and white conflict, many people said that's the most black and white conflict that I remember. Still, when we are now, it's the 4th year of war, I think that this tool is coming back. So maybe there is some truth to what they are saying. Maybe there is some truth, and we can see that those populist governments are gaining their strength in Czech Republic, in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Poland. We can see that.
But when it comes to 2022, when the war or the full-scale invasion comes to Ukraine, we see that the Russian propaganda even intensifies. And it is a model which intensifies on so many different levels. It intensifies on the level of culture, of film, of talking to journalists, of talking to a broader or general public. What I can say from, and maybe you can afterwards comment on it, what we found when we were shooting our documentary film on the history of Russian cinema in the past 30 years and how Russian cinema reacts to international crises, we found that cinema is like one of the very stellar pillars in Russian propaganda and disinformation. So actually, before we have hordes of European communists believing that there are NATO troops in Donbass in 2014, we see it on the Russian cinema screen. We see movies that show European soldiers in Ukraine fighting for Ukraine, with Ukraine, Americans fighting for them. So it is absolutely crazy. And when you link this to all the other elements of Russian propaganda, you see that all of them are connected. So you will see an increase. Once these films came out, you saw an increase of queries on Google and Yandex when they were looking for this to see if this is true. And then you have a media campaign by Medvedev, who was at the time really pushing for Russian films, who said, yes, these films are important because they are the truth. So how do you feel this propaganda is hitting outside also of Ukraine in Europe on so many different channels?
I think that the time for debate has come, because I am not fully agree with you here. because when the Russian propaganda was directed at Western audience since 2014, and it was extremely strong and extremely successful. It was very successful because I have been feeling we as Ukrainians have been feeling so alone since 2014 up until 2022, because everyone would believe these hybrid narratives. That's a hybrid war. Those are Russia-backed separatists. Those are Russian-supported. We even, do you remember the downing of MH17? It was never told, even though it's now proved in court that it was basically Russia who downed that. But anyway, we would be obliged to say that Russia-backed separatists or Russia-supported combatants have downed the aircraft. So we have been feeling very alone, and Russia has been trending and very successful in its propaganda efforts. But then, some months prior to the invasion, there was a drop in propaganda. I have been working on a research academic project on Russian Telegram channels, analyzing Russian narratives. And what I saw the drop. And I saw that their stories have become really less and less sophisticated. They did not try anymore. And that was a very alarming sign to me as a researcher, because they don't try, so they are really planning something. And their propaganda has started to be directed at internal audience. And internal audience is, of course, it does not require such a sophisticated effort. It can consume less sophisticated things. It can consume very blatant, open, simple messages. And as you remember that some days before the invasion, there was a story of some Polish combatants invading Donbass. You remember that?
Of course.
Like, it was a very badly staged, and I was really worried when I was reading, because it was so obvious, so evident, that I was reading that and thinking, guys, you can do much better than this, because this story is so fake. But it was already for internal audience, and those films are also like those films that Medvedev is commenting about. They are as well. They are for internal audience. They are for Russians. What we have to be careful about here in Europe, in Western Europe, are liberal Russians, so-called good Russians, because they do more sophisticated stuff. They still want you to be empathic about Russia. They want you to feel sympathy towards Russia. They want you to think that this is not Russia doing that, that's just one Putin, and as soon as Putin dies, the war will end. It will not.
It's interesting that you mentioned it, because Karamurza visited Luxembourg just yesterday.
Happy for you.
The biggest Luxembourgish newspaper published this morning the interview with him, and the headline of the interview says, "You cannot blame 140 million Russians for the war against Ukraine." That's the headline quote.
So this is the sophisticated stuff that I'm talking about. That this is much more, in my opinion, it is much more dangerous than this state propaganda. I think that state propaganda has intensified when it comes to these high-level corruption, high-level flows of money that are going to the governments. This has intensified with the war, that's for sure. But these state propaganda messages, not so much. But liberal Russians, they do that for the state, basically.
So you think that what we hear from these circles is as devastating as what we hear from official Kremlin channels?
It's not the same, and I don't know whether we can blame people for that they do not want their motherland to disintegrate, but I think we can, because empires, that's not the time for empires anymore. They have to be speaking about decolonizing Russia. They have to be speaking about giving autonomy at least to so many people that they are colonizing at the moment. This is something that they have to be speaking about. They have to be speaking about disintegration of Russia. And we have a very nice slogan in Ukraine, make Russia small again.
I have the T-shirt also. Yeah.
Okay, so that's what they have to be talking about, and some of them do, but well, Karamurza doesn't. Karamurza thinks that 140
40,
million
yeah.
Russians, they are not all Russians. Let's start with it.
Yeah, the same article quotes him. I'm freely quoting because I read it this morning. That of course there would be, quote, tens of thousands of people guilty of participating in the war, but if I look at one mobilization wave of 130, 150,000 people, and we are now facing the sixth major mobilization wave, so it's more in the millions if you're not counting the industrial military complex, the logistics aspects, the people openly supporting. So it's not a few thousand people, it is millions of people who are contributing not only to the war effort, but also to eagerly killing Ukrainians.
That's a philosophical question. Do you think there is a such thing as a collective guilt?
I think that definitely there was one after the Second World War, and we talked a lot about this. And I grew up here in Luxembourg, and I think the Luxembourgers here in the room can say it. How do we call the Germans after the war? Preisen, the Prussians, because we were already once under Prussian. Under Prussian garrison here in the fortress, much before, and it has stayed in the minds of people. So Preisen, that's how we used to talk to about the Germans, and so I think it is quite easy to just detach yourself from the question of collective guilt, because we are kind of like trying to say, oh no, that's behind us, the Second World War is behind us. And so we don't want to open the question about how guilty societies are in such cases. And I mean, the presidency of Putin started in '99. We've had the Chechen wars. Sorry, they weren't wars. They were operations to restore the order and operations, anti-terror operation. And then we had the war in Georgia, which also wasn't the war. We had the intervention in Syria, which wasn't the war. So as you can see, so we're not talking about collective guilt anymore, because as Europeans, I think we want to keep that in the past, and kind of like small children, like put the blanket over our head and say, no, the times like this have passed. And
this morning I've been reading an article about how Germany is going to come to battle Russian drones over their airports. And I had they have similar, it seems like they have a plan. But the article in general, it was on Deutsche Welle, that the article, I had a feeling that they have about 10 years of for developing this plan.
Okay.
You see that the feeling was that we are not talking about the thing that is already happening, that already that and that German airport have stopped working because of the drones, and the drones are flying over. Like the tone is like this, and that's really it scares me a lot. Just because the relax of a good and comfortable life seems to be so deeply integrated in European everyday life, and is maybe it's even understandable. I don't know what to do about that. I have no ideas.
Well, personally, I always say the saying, it's like we are marinated in wealth, and sometimes if you marinate also the meat too long, it's also not good. It's also my opinion. But if you come back to like this example of Germany, I mean, right now in the German bestseller list of books, we have two books which talk about that young people, young men who don't want to die for Germany, that don't want to die in the army, don't want to defend democracy. And these people are regularly on German TV shows, and also to quote some of them, they're saying that it won't be worse to die for democracy, better live under Putin in Germany. So, and these people are having bestseller books. They are talking to millions of audiences on social media. So it is a trend also, because we are simply ignoring in Europe how dangerous it is, and we are also, I think, now that it's fourth year of full-scale invasion and many more years of war against Ukraine, we are totally oblivious to what it means to be a neighbor of Russia. And that is just something that doesn't work here anymore. The other day I was having a debate, because right now the focus is quite a lot, and also rightly so, also on the war in Middle East. And somebody said, yeah, but you see, the other day there was an older man who told me this. The other day there was 800 drones against Ukraine in one night, but only like 5 people died. So the Russian army must be much more humane than the army in Israel, for instance. And so, you know, there's so much cynicism when you deconstruct this argument, and that I'm also quite sometimes like really feeling hopeless about how ill-informed and also how ill-prepared Europeans are when it comes to facing Russian imperial threats.
And that's why Putin pushes further and further here. And Russia is escalating further and further just because it does not receive any response, any real response. Just I think that you would agree with me if I would say that some months ago it was unimaginable that drones will be flying all over Europe. We are now have dozens of instances: Denmark, Poland, Germany, many countries are already involved in that. Denmark is taking courses from Ukraine how to down the drones, because they were like, Polish case showed us that they would try to down the drone that would cost like a couple of thousand euros. They would down it with $1 million worth rocket. So of course it's inefficient. Of course it's just a crazy thing to do. And but even some months ago it was unimaginable, and now it is already happening. And I think that this indecisiveness, I don't know how to combat it. I don't know. I have no answers here, no ideas.
I think that the most disturbing and the most dangerous part of, for instance, the drone incursion in the Polish airspace a few weeks ago is not the fact that they went in there for a couple of hours and they were spying over the headquarters of the Polish Navy, and they were spying over different airports and military installations. But it was the fact that we allowed it, and we allowed Russia to blur the border between war and peace. Because next time it will not be 19 drones, it will be 30 drones. And then we'll keep continuing like having philosophical debates whether to shoot them down. It almost feels like they're an endangered species. Like, can we shoot down the drone? Is that okay for the environment? Like it really feels like this, like they have a life, like they have some, and it's absolutely crazy. And
exactly. This morning I read about the drones flying over Belgian a military factory. No, I can say that
it was a military base.
A military,
a training center.
Not just the training center, but the enterprise that is producing drones, rockets and drones, including for Ukrainian army. So the drones have been spying over this enterprise, and there are discussions now in Belgium whether we have to shoot them down or not, and maybe it's too dangerous because if we're shooting down, so the rubbles. But you are the military factory, so you have some kind of bunker, some kind of cover, shelter under your in your basement. So Yeah, you don't think that it does have.
Yeah.
So you have to evacuate your employees and try to do that. That's what we are doing every day. But I can't believe that it's 4 years of war in Ukraine,
Yeah.
and Ukrainians are so unfortunately we're so used to that everyday downing of drones. And if you go pick mushrooms, just take care, maybe some rubbles are still there in the forest. That's what we have to keep in mind, and that's fine. But I think that maybe it's time. We have been talking so much about NATO opening training for Ukrainians that now we are talking about Ukraine opening training for NATO, maybe.
Yeah, and it already has started because I know at least of one skill share that happened between the Polish and Ukrainian army about downing of the drones and about deploying the cost-effective measures of going against the drones. So, but what my argument before was that by doing this, they are blurring the lines between war and peace. So suddenly, for Europe, 19 drones, or for NATO, 19 drones is not an invasion of the airspace. So next time it will be 35 drones, and we'll end up in one night where it will be 600 drones, and they will fly at targets in the Baltics or in one of the isles in in the North Sea or in the East Sea, and then we'll just be like, okay, is this an act of war or not? Because Russia will not declare war. I mean, that for sure we know. If war happens, Russia will not declare it. And so it is a really, really, yeah, an absolutely crazy situation at this moment.
My guess is that Russia in the future, maybe even in the close future, it will try to attack some infrastructure object, and then we will have a philosophical debate. If no one died, and this infrastructure has somehow survived, whether we can think that an act of war or not. And we will be having these philosophical debates more and more until we have to find some answers.
Yeah, and basically the same is true for other civilian targets in Ukraine, for the nuclear power plants, for the critical infrastructure, where also nothing happened. But before we give the floor, or give the microphone to the floor, I would like to talk about what can we learn from all this, and do we have counter strategies? What can we do?
Do you have counter strategies?
Well, for one thing, I think it's not to shut up and to keep Ukraine on the daily agenda of European politicians. I know it's not sexy. I know it's not gonna bring a lot of votes, but it has to be done because probably sooner than later we'll have to explain to young people that we're going to have compulsory military service and that people also will have to go to war. That's my, I mean, don't want to, I want that people prove me wrong, and I want that the future proves me wrong, but that's my honest opinion, that there will be large large scale land war in Europe quite soon. So we should keep it on the agenda. And we also should, I think, from a legislative side, be much, much more tough. Because, in my opinion, especially some of the propaganda is, for me, not anymore part of free speech. So we have to learn the lessons there from the Second World War. I'm not talking about having internal camps for the Japanese like the Americans had, but we definitely need some legislative sides to have a much, much, much stricter sanctions on Russia, which are not only for financial capital, but also on people, and to have a Magnitsky level sanctions on a much, much broader level. I think this is where it will actually hurt. It will. The middle class in Russia still is a bit not feeling the war. I think this is something that we as Europeans can do. I mean, those of us who went on vacation this summer anywhere in Europe, Russian language, you hear it more again. Huh? So, and that's, so that's something where we can heard, and the rest is also have legislation which forbids it. I mean, we are having hate speech legislations in Europe which are quite successful. I cannot go somewhere and say that the Holocaust didn't happen. It is right that people get dragged in front of police and a judge because of that. But we can start to do the same if it is hurtful about other people's history. And I think there we need to be much more stricter. And it's very tough to say it, but I think that we will not counter it by just like having free speech heaven like in the US. I think it's the wrong way.
I would add to what you have said. I agree with that, but also I would add that we need to be more direct. I mean that it's let's not play with that balance, that it's not everything is not so evident, not so obvious. It is evident, it is obvious. There is good and bad side here, and that's okay, because we've been fooled by Russia into that story of hybrid conflict, hybrid truth. Everything is hybrid now. It's not even hybrid war. It is war, and let's be more direct. And we can even see, as a researcher, as a language researcher, I can see that Ukrainian language in general and Ukrainian media discourse, political discourse, it has become very direct. We even swear much more than we used to before the war. But at the same time, Russian media, including liberal Russian media like Dozhd or who claim themselves as liberal, they are getting less and less direct. They use all these euphemisms for explosions, for there is a dangerous situation, not an attack of Ukrainian drones. So all these euphemisms are the Russian media are filled with that, and I want European media and us as representatives of European, Western, or whatever you would name it, civilization, be more direct. Use direct language and say things as they are.
That's a very interesting point, and also as a freelance journalist, I think that you're absolutely right. And I think the death of journalism is when I hear, for instance, National Public Radio or any other radio, major, for instance, German public broadcasters, where at the end of every segment on any war in the world, they say these claims are not independently verifiable. So the claims that were made were, and that's for every war right now, after every segment. And then I say, I'm sorry, but maybe I don't know anything about my job, but I think it's your job as a reporter, as a journalist, to find out what is the truth and report about it, because otherwise it's the false balance. Because suddenly the drones, the Ukrainian drones, which are hitting exclusively military and infrastructure targets, which are financing or firing up the Russian war effort, are turning into the same as drones attacks against Ukrainian cities. And this comparison, I have seen it already also now on many times, where journalists say there was a mass attack against Ukraine, but Ukrainian drones also hit Russian oil refineries. So the comparison is already stupid with the payload and the material that was being used and the targets. But it's so crazy that this is getting a standard in the news, and it's for any other war whether it has been the exchanges between Israel and Iran. It's the same. The claims or this has not been independently verifiable, and for me that's the end also of journalism somehow.
Yeah, even when we can see that in the media, Ukraine claims that.
Yeah.
And okay, you have your media, you have your media representatives there. You have offices in Kiev. You have correspondents that you send to the front line. What does this mean? Ukraine claims 5 people died. I mean, they have really died.
Yeah, exactly. And because they think they have to say this, and this is why it's getting so dangerous. And it's getting so dangerous because It is like the kind of small stickers you put on toys, like the choking hazard that they put on the news and saying, well, because we're reporting about Russia, it's not independently verifiable. But if you then, again, in a war, which is very black and white, and this war is very black and white, use this kind of language, it creates the false impression outside that why not? Maybe the Ukraine is also targeting cities. Maybe they are also, because after all, I know that they are Nazis, and I know that they had Polish fighters in Donbass 10 years ago. And then again, you start working with these cliches and these small seeds of doubt which already exist.
Yeah, I'm just afraid that being so democratic, being so for liberal values, we will end up as a classic totalitarian society that names explosions or attacks. They say it's loud noise has been heard in Belgorod or whatever.
Yeah.
So we will end up with this. We will avoid calling things as they really are.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, we also speak about bavovna sometimes. So.
That's a marking, yeah, because it's the how would you say that the Russians would also use this euphemism for explosion. They would say it chlapok, meaning a clap. A clap has been heard in the air, so no one knows what's that. Maybe somehow they're connected to the war, but no, we don't think so. That's just a clap. So yeah, Ukraine is just mocking these euphemisms, right?
Before, okay, this is my cue for the room. Think about your questions. But before we go there, is there maybe something you want to add before we go to the questions?
Be careful with good Russians.
Yeah. Yeah, be careful with good Russians. I would agree. And also be careful of what we call in Europe the useful idiots. The useful idiots are people who can be politicians, who can be academics, who can be scientists, who are voluntarily or involuntarily, but for me, involuntarily in this case, it's a tough sell, who are voluntarily pushing the narrative and who are pushing Russian propaganda points and who are contributing like that, that also these arguments start to becoming traction and that they are kind of seeping into our DNA in the public debate. And this is something which is very, very, very difficult. We could have talked now a lot about Russia more and about the last fortress of traditional values, as Russia likes to call itself. If ever you encounter this, these traditional values, what they actually mean is the highest rate of divorce on the earth, the legalization of violence against your partner at home, or for instance what we saw 2 weeks ago, organizing the biggest get-together of European far-right fascists and neo-Nazis in St. Petersburg. That's traditional values according to Russia. So beware of them as well. Oh, we sure did talk a lot now. And I hope that there's a third microphone. We already got questions.
Thank you. What I wanted to start with was with all the Russification evil the Soviet Union may have performed. And we could also talk about virtually uprooting the Romanian language in Moldova, because at some point it was decided that it had to be written in Cyrillic letters. And with Cyrillic letters, the first generation of pupils that go through schooling in the Romanian language with Cyrillic letters are cut off from their literature in the Romanian language because it didn't happen in the Cyrillic alphabet before. We could talk about many of these instances, but what I find relatively remarkable is that at the end of the day, the Soviet Union was the only halfway peaceful time the Russians had. Notwithstanding Holodomor, notwithstanding the brutalization of linguistics, notwithstanding all that, but there was a time, and there was an only time, during the Soviet Union when the Russian Empire was not evil to others, to neighbors, to supposedly inferior people around, to whoever else they might have been. It has done that ever before, I mean, from the Mongol conquest onward, to Ivan the Terrible and to the Romanovs. And it's been doing it again ever since Russia is an independent state again. And I believe a little bit of historic conscience about this fact would be helpful. We're not teaching it in schools, but we should. Just as well as we should teach that it is funny that in the year 2025 of the Lord, after the United Nations have been around for 80 years, after we've been talking about decolonization, self-determination of peoples for all this time, we should still accept that Russia specifically is entitled to a sphere of influence around itself, and that it is us, you of course, but us as well, who have dared to violate this legitimate Russian sphere of influence ever since apparently in 1990 we promised that NATO would not expand eastward, and well, it did. Nobody seems to seize the idiocy of the argument. How would anyone have promised to a Russian, Boris Yeltsin in this case still, how would anyone, European or American, have promised that 100 million people to the east of Europe are not going to choose for themselves and by themselves which alliance they want to belong to? How can we in 2025 accept in Europe and in this country that there is a notion around which says Russia is entitled to what they used to call the near abroad, Ruski mir in its most delicate fashion, so to speak, and we must not interfere, and if we do, they're going to send at least drones, maybe nuclear missiles. This is something that is absolutely outrageous to me. And what is even more outrageous to me is that in this country, which has been brutalized in history just as much as any other, I'm not trying to diminish the level of suffering in other places, but this nation should know what we're talking about. There is not a single family in this country that does not have somebody dead in the Second World War, somebody, like in my family, we had people dead in the Second World War. I had one uncle who was forcibly recruited into the German army. He wanted to become a priest before the war. He came back from the Eastern Front and said, God does not exist. I'm changing tack, because if God existed, he wouldn't tolerate something like that. I had another uncle who went to a concentration camp, committed suicide in 1971 because he couldn't live with the memory. So every family in Luxembourg has situations like that. In this society, we keep accepting that the Russians have a legitimate interest, and we even accept that we have one member of the European Parliament who's been kicked out of the European Conservative and Reformist group, been elected for ADR, and who for all intents and purposes now is no longer a Luxembourgish MEP, but a Russian MEP. Because all he does is Russian propaganda. That this should happen to my country, to be I was an MEP myself, so sad connection. But that this should happen to my country is not something that I would have ever believed, and it did. So yes, they are strong, they're still too strong, and I can only agree to everyone who says, say it clearly. Russia is evil. Most of the Russians support the regime. They do so even without being violated. They do it out of their own volition because they believe in Russian greatness, Ruski mir, all the civilizational mission that the Russians apparently have had for 1,000 years, whereas 1,000 years ago nobody knew what a Russian was. And always bear in mind where the name comes from. The Russians call themselves Russians and want to Russify the world because the Finns at the time called the Swedes in their own language Ruotsi. That is where the Rus comes from, and that is where the name of Russia comes from. So the fact that the Finns called Scandinavians something now makes Slavs want to dominate the world. I find this funny.
Thank you very much. So, perfectly additions. I think that maybe while answering the other questions, we can also touch upon this. So, more questions? I will repeat it then for the room. It's easier, I think. Yeah.
We just can repeat that in the mic because that's a very important point, that an apology can issue it to someone who asked for it. If someone says sorry, then you can apologize something, because now we can hear some calls for reconciliation with Russians without Russians being involved in these efforts, who don't even ask for apology to be issued for. Thanks for this point. That's very important.
Yeah, that's you. So, questions in the room? Yeah, I have the second row. So the question is why many non-ethnic Russians are going to the front for Russia.
They are. That's. I think it's in the nature of Russian soul, maybe, that a Russian society, of this authoritarian, totalitarian society that creates, because Russia does not have regular army in Ukraine. It did create the basically the combatants. Yeah, how can the mercenaries basically yes, those are the people who are in the first place financially motivated. We have so many video evidences and other evidences when families from the, because Russia is not an equal country. There are so many very poor villages, especially in the north, because the empire sucks out all the resources from its from other parts of the country to the metropolis. And of course, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the share of those who join Russian army is tiny, because only maybe some crazy volunteers, I don't know, very ideologically fueled. But in this poor Russia, yes, they are financially motivated, and even their families ask for that. Their families are sending their sons, their husbands, because for them it's huge money. If you are talking about different Russian regions have different fees for joining army, but we are talking about $15,000 as a single payment when you join the army. That's huge money. Like for Ukraine, that's huge money, but Ukraine does not pay such money to soldiers at all. We have a regular army, like an army that defends the country, and everyone is mobilized. But in Russia, that's huge money. That's big money even for many. I think for many European countries, if you just receive, just for the fact that you are joining, you receive 15 grand. That's a lot. So yeah, they are financially motivated. I think so.
And as an addition, I think that's also as a reply to Frank's, who said that it was relatively peaceful in Russia. I agree. But one thing I would disagree is the Afghanistan intervention. And also if you talk about this, because I think all what we are seeing today with Russia, we already have the blueprints from the Soviet Union. And if you're now looking for the biggest memorials of the war against Afghanistan and the invasion of Afghanistan, they are not inside of Russia. You will find them in Belarus, you will find them in Tajikistan, you will find them in other countries, because the Russians were not fighting this war on behalf of the Soviet Union. And the war started to become really unpopular when the Russians were being shot down in the helicopters. Because before it was Ukrainians, Belarusians, and of course, as mostly people from Asia, who were being forced to fight this very bloody war, which the Soviet Union quit after somewhere between 10 and 30,000 casualties. So we are 100 times less than now. Yeah. Yeah.
I would just remind also, when we are talking about peacefulness of the Soviet Union, that it was a relatively peaceful time, but Soviet Union has conducted dozens of military campaigns all around the globe, but they were not so large scale, so we can call them like real wars. But for some people, they were real wars, like in Africa, all over the globe. And I would also remind you how Soviet flag looked like. There was a globe on the Soviet flag, and it was an official slogan for they were promoting the world revolution. So they were basically like preparing to invade, like to occupy the world with this crazy ideology. And also so yeah, we just have we have to keep in mind. And even when I was talking about lingua franca, one of the arguments they were talking about when trying to invent this universal language is that because and Latinize also the languages in the Soviet Union, that's because they had an intention to occupy the entire globe, and it will just make the task easier to have a common language.
So it's the role of Russian cultural centers, them being linked to FSB, and their role in the different European countries was the question. Well, let's start with Luxembourg. As you know, the structure of these cultural centers is more or less everywhere the same. There is a central agency in Moscow which is allocating money, which is controlled by the FSB. They call this the Agency for the Commonwealth, for cultural questions, cultural partnerships, and for humanitarian aid. That's the name of its of this agency, which had last year a budget of, if I'm correct, 5.5 billion rubles, which would be around 80 or now maybe more 70 million euros. They are promoting cultural events in European cities. The Luxembourgish Russian Cultural Center is getting money from this place. So, and this is in the Russian security structure apparatus, it belongs to the FSB. So, and this was the same in Soviet times with the KGB funneling money towards cultural institutions. You are right, they are always or often very close to strategic points. There was a recent very interesting study that the Russian Orthodox churches in Finland are generally between 500 meters and 2 kilometers from a military installation. So I don't know why the Finnish army is in so desperate need of the Russian Orthodox Church, but it seems that they are kind of like attracting each other. So, but that's it's a phenomenon, and we have the data to support it. And in Russian, these cultural center, of course, offer languages. They are there to cater also to the Russian speakers in the country. But here they also organize Russian cultural events also outside of these centers. And this is where it gets interesting because all these Russian theater plays and comedy shows that we see here in Luxembourg, but also elsewhere, they promote like a feeling that everything is okay in Russia, so that there can be comedy stars, there can be musicians, there can be theater plays. And if you watch these shows, I mean, they're not talking about the war. So there's like this normalization that we're just like you guys, our comedy stand-up routines will be about, oh, my wife didn't do the dishes. But you come from a country that's has launched the most massive war in the history of the 21st century and of the past 80 years. So it is absolutely crazy, like how this continues. And one thing is clear and should be clear for everyone who wants to downplay this. Russian embassies and Russian cultural groups, they have a plan for Luxembourg, as well as they have a plan for France, for Germany. And here in Luxembourg, it is not really on the agenda or on the radar of the authorities. It hasn't been broadly discussed. It is really an issue. Because the Russian embassy hasn't diminished in size since the full-scale invasion here. So we have to be very wary of that fact. So the activities is ongoing, and We are just not. We are just ignoring this in Luxembourg, and that's my exact reaction to this. And so yeah, it's a major problem. Maybe you want to add.
Yeah, I will just add that sometimes when we protest against Anna Netrebko, favorite singer of Putin's favorite singer, or Russian ballet, sometimes we feel so um, stupid, so radical, that because people like, what will happen if she just comes to the stage and she sings and she leaves? Like, why are Ukrainians are so crazy? Maybe they're right about you, that you are not reasonable, you're not making a reason. But I think that's where we have to become black and white, because she sings, then she leaves, and she will leave the feeling of that the things that are ongoing are normal. She will just normalize what Russia does.
Yeah, and I mean, this is also like a very emotional topic, but like all the concerts, I think that Netrebka is a very good example, because all the concerts she's singing here in Europe are spots she's taking from Ukrainian volunteer artists, violinists, actors who have been killed on the front, and she's taking up that space. And I remember, if you ever have the chance to walk into a Ukrainian university, like if you walk into a Ukrainian university, the first thing you will see is the unfinished diplomas. It's young people who died in the invasion, and each photo is heartbreaking. And so if you think about that, that's the real cost of war for Ukrainians, and it is just not being visualized enough here, and that's a huge issue. Yeah.
And then they will also. There was a very popular Russian saying in 90s that we are filling Ukraine and other former Soviet republics with Russian singers, Russian culture. Because where is your culture? Ukrainian culture is underdeveloped. You don't have so much cultural products. So we will help you here. We will provide this humanitarian aid for you. But maybe it's because you have executed so many Ukrainian cultural activists, Ukrainian singers, writers, poets, and so on. And this process, that's a heartbreaking and very sensitive topic, that this process is ongoing. We have books, collection of poems with many poets and writers who are no longer alive just because of the Russia.
Yeah, and I think it's a very powerful argument that you give, because it is not only like this argument about culture that you just mentioned. They do it the same, like saying, "Oh, you need the Russian language, you need the Russian culture, you need the Russian actors," and in the same moment, and I think that's very clear. Also, if you watch, like from my research over the past 2 years with Russian cinema, it's like this narrative, but the most powerful narrative is, and on top of that, because of all of that, you are incapable of building a state. And so your state is artificial because you don't have our language, you don't have culture, you don't have the same as we do. Therefore, you must be incapable of building a state. And this comes on top of it. And people here don't grasp that this is like really the theoretical pillars on which murder happens against Ukrainian civilians, because this has been put out. And yeah.
You have mentioned very good that you have mentioned this argument, because this is an important thing to hear, that one of the most successful propaganda narratives created and fueled by Russia is that Ukraine is a failed state. Ukraine is a corrupt, failed state. It is disintegrating by itself. Ukrainians are not real nation, and so on and so forth. And this is a very real story here.
Yeah, because I see a lot of people with books in their hands. Maybe one more question? Or questions, just to repeat for the room very quickly, the role of Russian language nowadays, because you hear it quite a lot in Ukraine, especially also in Kiev, and also the book which was translated and how you translated several very Ukrainian jargons.
Thanks a lot. That's very nice to hear. So first about the language, I will try to be as brief as possible. I know that many of you here, probably you are Ukrainian speakers. Maybe some of you are Russian speakers. But when I go by bus here and I can hear Russian language. So my physical reaction is quite bad. Like I got sweaty palms, my heart is pounding. So because I don't know, maybe they are Russians, maybe I don't know. I don't like being in this situation. Neither I like being in that situation in Ukraine. But that's my personal preferences. You said that maybe these people should not exist. Well, they should exist. Let them exist. That's okay. After decades of Russification, that's okay that some people keep using that language. We cannot. I don't think that we can do anything about that. But what we need as Ukrainian speakers, we have to protect our language rights. I would just remind you how the situation has changed so much. In 2008, when I graduated the university in Kiev, I did not have a single job interview in Ukrainian. I was applying for media jobs. Not a single interview. So we are talking about protection of my rights as a Ukrainian speaker. I want to have jobs available in Ukrainian. I want to be Ukrainian, to be the language of as a first option in the service. I want my kids to have an access to Ukrainian language, dance school, whatever. So whenever there is some service that is provided by you in Ukraine, it should be available in Ukrainian. So this is about our own rights as Ukrainian speakers. We cannot control how people talk in public transport or in the streets. That's beyond our control. So we have to focus on ourselves and on protection our own rights and the rights of our children in Ukraine. So, and of course we can, no one forbids, no one limits some conversations with with other Ukrainians. If you want them to understand deeper the history, if you want them to understand that some people may think that they are Russians if they speak Russian here, so you can talk about that. I do talk about that, but I understand the limits here. So that's the first one. And the second, very brief, you asked about how we translate it. That's more an adaptation as a translation. It's more like adapted text. They have changed considerably, but there is a word zamachatisa, and it's called wear yourself out or it doesn't count.
Yeah, I think the language is also like a question that we get a lot in Europe about, and we already touched it. There's maybe an anecdote, which also two stories from Ukraine, which touched me very much, was when I was interviewing victims of occupation of Bucha. There was a young family who was really living through, like watching through the window and listening to what is happening in the streets. And this young woman, she said that after what happened to us in Bucha, when now I'm on the metro in Kiev or when I'm on the bus and I see Ukrainian soldiers speaking Russian, I think about the Russian soldiers in Bucha. So when I see somebody in a uniform, I automatically think about these experiences. So you see that it's a very, very emotional and tricky subject. And the second story, which I want to tell about, just about that, is we were at the funeral of a fallen colleague, Swampy, who was a sapper, so a deminer who also at the beginning of the full-scale invasion happened to be working with the Azov battalion as a soldier, and on his funeral, there was a captain from Azov regiment who was telling the funeral speech, and he was doing it in Ukrainian and in English. But when he came down the podium to his regular soldiers from Azov, they said, "Oh, хорошо, брат." So you see that it's there's so many links to this and so many layers. So it's like a Napoleon cake of this language issues. And yeah.
Add a very silly story from Germany. There was some media published a story, maybe a couple of years ago, that Ukrainians got beaten up in Germany by Russians, and then there was an investigation, and then it appeared that there were two companies of Ukrainians that have beaten up each other. Both companies were speaking Russians, but both companies thought that the other company are Russians. So it's a perfectly very funny and extremely silly story. So yeah, be careful while speaking Russian, especially abroad, because you may find yourself in a very unpleasant and very well covered by media situation.
And I guess that now we will have a small drink. And maybe if Ayla wants to have the floor to say thank you or to say something more, please do. But otherwise, we would still be available for a drink here. The biggest thanks, of course, is for the audience and for Eugenia to make it here such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Philippe, for this conversation. Thanks. And I would also like to thank Ayla and Simo, who in the first place invited me here. So thanks for having me here. Thank you.
Well, and I would like to extend thanks to Katerina, who has contributed greatly, to Nadia, who has been very helpful and supportive, and well, it's visible what you have done. So thank you very much.
Yeah, so I would like to give a few flowers to, I think you will not take them tomorrow morning in airplane, but we will find how to deal with it. But at least for the moment and for the film, we have a nice picture with some flowers.
Thank you, Ben. Okay.
And additionally, something for you to take with you. We have taken, I think this could be a good toy for 3, 4, 5-year-old girl, for example, if you happen to have one.
She's beautiful.
Okay. And it is the symbol of Luxembourgish resistance.
That's very
There is a story here in the box.
Okay, and then to Philip. Okay, I mean, I was hesitating to offer flowers, so so this is so I chose a plant which is supposed to be bring you well-being. So I hope this will work.
Thanks, everyone, and please join us to have a drink, right? Simo, come closer to us.